He's been living there under everybody's noses for all this.
Kansas City. So like Ash mentioned, if you have any questions, you're welcome to put it in the chat box. I think we're a little bit smaller group than we originally anticipated. So if something comes up and you're like, I don't want to wait till the end, feel free to raise your hand, especially as we get into Misty's area when we're talking about specific things that you may have experienced within your community, within your background. I think that lends itself to a really good discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and share some slides with you all. The professor and me wants to be able to kind of lecture around specifics. So a lot of the information that's contained on these slides, and we can provide them to Ash if anybody has any additional questions, would be kind of a overview course in criminal justice and criminology in 2 hours. So it's really fast, it's pretty dirty, but we get you the information that you need in order to be able to have conversations from this criminogenic lens. So we're going to walk through a little bit about what I teach in a course about criminology, which is, the study of crime. We'll go through a little bit about the specifics when we're looking at how we measure crime, because there are some fallacies around where we should be getting statistics and what statistics we should be relying on. And then I will throw the presentation to Misty, and she will walk us through kind of a little bit more in depth on what's happening in Kansas City community response, and then some of the gaps that we see. We both were practitioners in Kansas City, so we approach talking about crime a little bit differently, and I think that will be really helpful, especially as the league is wanting to continue to grow in this area. So my first question is going to be around this idea of what we think causes crime. So the study of crime or criminology is really rich with different philosophies as to why people commit crime. Studies in this area really show correlation between factors, but very few criminologists will really go as far as saying that there's causation, right? Criminological theory, they're primarily concerned with determining the reasons behind that criminal behavior, right? And I think that's really, as league members, where we come in and say, okay, what can we be doing? How can we be helping? Where are efforts best put? We, as criminologists, provide those practical guidelines for agencies, criminal justice systems, within communities, local nonprofit groups. So what do we believe, right, before we go through this conversation, what do we believe right off the bat causes crime? You can, poverty. Thank you, Erica.
Desperation.
Desperation, great. So when I pose this question to, my 18 to 25-year-old, mental health resources, lack of education. Yeah, exactly. So when I pose this question to my students, and typically they would take a criminology course during their maybe sophomore or junior year in college, they will note, maybe people want to fit in, or this is how they were raised, or they didn't know that they were breaking the law, right? So they approach it as someone who's 18 to 25. Why would someone that age break the law, right? We typically don't talk about life course, like what happens throughout your life and how criminality changes through the life course until a little bit later in the semester. So all great answers, right? Mental health, lack of resources, the strain or desperation that occurs. And the good news is you're all right? Like, you get the points, you did it. We have a lot of different looks, lenses that we can think about criminality. especially from if we're looking at juveniles or we're looking at adults. So the way that we position those theories of crime and theories of criminality tend to be around these big umbrella topics. And criminology in general is sociological in nature, right? So we're going to be looking at kind of the broad perspective, what occurs across society, and then we're going to be breaking that down. What happens throughout a neighborhood? What happens throughout a school? How does that change? So when we move into this idea of classicalism, we have to remember that classical criminologists argue that a man is a rational being. So they're going to seek to maximize their pleasure, minimize their pain, and all their decision making is derived from that principle. So the way that we think about crime is always through rational, maximize pleasure, minimize pain. As we move that into a criminological theory, the benefits of engaging in crime far outweigh, or they may slightly outweigh, the costs associated with that type of crime. But most crimes, even those that seem irrational, right, like murder, seems irrational, but they involve some sort of decision making at some level. It could be a very small amount, but there's some sort of decision making that's taking place. So regardless of the act or the circumstance around the act, the individual used the information that's available to them to decide to commit a crime. So this is this very classical view of criminology, and people still prescribe to that to this day, right? Like, I want those shoes, I'm going to get those shoes, I probably won't get caught, I'm going to do it, right? Very classical way of thinking rationally. Unlike classicalism, when we move into this positivist thought or positivism, it does not argue that man is a rational being. So instead, we focus on the individuals outside of their control. So this could be biology, psychology, kind of what is going on that affects their criminality. And we have to remember that the social environment from this particular perspective, the positivist school, is only important insofar that it interacts or causes biological or psychological, what we consider dysfunction, right? Led by Cesar Lombroso. There's a lot of Caesars when you start to talk about criminology, and Cesar Lombroso is really the one that you'll hear about in most criminology courses. And he is often credited with advancing the scientific method within criminology. And he says that when we're looking at this perspective, it's only when we're talking about the study of crime and criminality that we start to think about this idea of atavist criminals, right? So what are those? Genetic throwbacks. So people who don't evolve the same way. They resemble their physical or anatomical structure of primitive animals, right? And you can see some of this racist, right? Like, let's call a spade, this racist idea around criminality that still prevails today, right? You can tell people that are criminal based on how they look, right? And that makes sense to us today that it's like, that's racist. But back in the day, Cesar Lombroso was like, hey, I got a new idea for you. All criminals look like genetic throwbacks. Well, then he kind of pulled back a little bit and he said, okay, maybe like a third of them look like criminals, but the ones that look like criminals are like the worst criminals, right? It still should be scary to you, right? But he had some good ideas around the scientific method and that we need to be doing actual studies that are following, we're going to make a hypothesis, we're going to do some research, we're going to form theory, even if his theory was a little bit off base. We'll call it off base. So in later works, he kind of evolves this idea that everyone who looks like a criminal is a criminal. And he kind of says, maybe not quite. So when we get into these sociological theories, we start to look at the social environment as the starting point. And I really think this is kind of where Junior League is really going to come into play, because we can start to look at the micro level. So what's happening, social learning, what's happening with social control. But then we can also start to look at the more macro idea, right? Like what's happening in the neighborhood, what's happening with the schools, what's happening with nutrition around what's going on with crime, right? So when you look at understanding criminality we're looking at the micro level, what motivates that particular person to commit a crime. And the first and the biggest dog in this area, I would say, would be social learning theory. So Akers poses this idea of social learning theory. And the basic premise of it is criminality is learned via exposure, right? So exposure to and adoption of definitions of law violation. So if you're around it, you're learning it, it's normalized to you, and those social structures affect your social learning. So how does this take place in the community? Differential association, right? So exposure to favorable and unfavorable definitions of crime. Differential reinforcement. So the balance of anticipated and actual rewards or punishments that follow that behavior, in this sense, criminality. Imitation, right? So like what your little friends are doing, you're going to start doing too. And so engaging in behavior and observing how others are affected by that behavior, how they're responding to that behavior. And then your own personal definitions, right? So our attitudes, our meanings of certain behavior. So social learning theory, I think, comes into play when you're looking at that micro level of criminality. Social control or social process, which is also one of those micro level theories, is looking at the way in which individuals are socialized and how that affects their criminality. So how were you socialized? What is the socialization that you're exposed to, right? So are you exposed to bank robbers, right? So you kind of know how that world works. It's something that is normalized within your relationship and your family. So both social learning and social control theories are considered theories of social process. However, their theoretical positions are contrary. So instead of focusing on the macro units, like the neighborhood, right? This particular neighborhood and the crime that takes place there, it's shifting to the micro level. What's happening with that individual person? And the basic philosophy or premise around these social control theories is that we all have inclinations to commit crime, right? Like I was a little bit late to get to UMKC today, and I was like, should I speed? But like, I know coming down Ward Parkway at 5:30, there's going to be a bike cop, right? So I weigh that out. I have social inclinations to not commit crime, right? External that's coming into me. So we're socially controlled to not commit crime under this theory. So what happens if you don't have that person or that collective group of people that's telling you don't participate in that particular crime? So that's social bond theory with Hershey. And he really looks at delinquency. So the kiddos that are in the neighborhoods. Delinquency occurs when an individual's ties or your bonds, right? So the bonds to that particular society are weakened. And we work with these kiddos, right? Like if you're looking at areas that Junior League focuses, this is really where we spend some time and have historically spent time, right? So there are 4 elements of social bond: attachment to others, right? Like making sure there's an emotional connection, that you've got somebody that you can call on, that you've got some sort of regard for others, right? Commitment to conformity. So investment in these pro-social activities, big brothers, big sisters, little league, things that are taking place that are like, hey, I have other people within the community that care about me, and they would be disappointed if I sped down Ward Parkway, right? And like got pulled over in front of everybody. Involvement in what we consider conventional activities. So efforts to extend those pro-social activities, and then belief in conventional values. If you don't know what the conventional values are, you can't prescribe to them, right? But if you have someone that's saying, this is the way we should participate, here is how we act within society, it's a lot easier to follow through. So that all kind of focuses on social environment. When you get into understanding crime from social disorganization or enemy theory, social disorganization by Shaw and McKay was basically how they mapped out the city of Chicago. And they said, hey, we've got these 5 zones that are taking place in Chicago, And the middle zone, zone 1, is going to be kind of the hub, the downtown area. Zone 2 is what they call the slums, right? Not my words, their words, the slums. Zone 3 is the zone of the working men. So where they're, they're working down in the middle of the community, but they're living in zone 3. Zone 4 is going to be residential. Zone 5 is the commuter zone. You can see how Kansas City looks like that, right? You can see pockets of how those zones take place. But what they're talking about here is really the zone in transition. So that zone 2 that they consider the zone in transition, and how we can look at delinquency, right? So we look at delinquency in zone 2, and it traditionally is the highest. So delinquency is high in zone 2. Why is that? So they're arguing that instead of looking at zone 2 and saying, well, it's poverty, that's what's causing delinquency within that particular area, they think it is more nuanced. And their theory looks at poverty, which leads to heterogeneity, residential instability, which leads to social disorganization, which leads to what they consider cultural transmissions of criminal values, which leads to delinquency. So they're saying, hey, we understand it's a lot easier to say A to B, but we think it is really nuanced. And so they don't really explain a lot about what social disorganization looks like, but they do provide this breakdown of social institutions. And we can see that in Kansas City. And then the last theory that I want to talk about is general strain theory. So this idea of I want in a legal way, so I'm going to do illegal things to do it. So there's lots of different types of strain: failure to achieve your goals, removal of positive stimuli, and then what we're really concerned with is the presentation of negative stimuli. So it has to be how these strains cause the emotional, the negative emotional state. So what does this all mean for Kansas City, right? Like, how do we take this and apply it to Kansas City? The first thing that we can look at is, how do we get information about crime in Kansas City? I'll stop my share for a second, but where do you all turn to when you want information about crime and how it's occurring in Kansas City? You can put it in the chat or just let me know.
So realizing obviously we're recording. So my husband is in law enforcement. So I know it's very convenient for the purposes of this conversation that he would be my primary source. And then I would say, and then just other community groups or maybe through church even. I think there's some people that are connected in that way that would have some information.
Those are great, great. Lexi says the news articles, YouTube clips.
This is Sarah, and kind of on the same thread. I'm a criminal defense attorney, so whatever my clients get charged with is how I am learning what's going on. But also there's a very tight-knit community of criminal defense attorneys, so we kind of all keep each other apprised of what's kind of going on in which areas. And, you know, is Clay County, Kansas City different than Jackson County, Kansas City different than, you know, Cass County, and all the good things.
Yeah, what they're experiencing and at what level. Yeah.
I will add in there for Lindsay and I teaching, easily 80% of students will tell you they get all of their news from social media. So I think that that's really important for us to keep in mind in the context of that's not just students, right? So when we're thinking about people who are engaged in the work, right? So Sarah, you, for people who are engaged in law enforcement, that their method of intaking that information is just so different than the general population, and the way in which that influences our ability to have really meaningful conversations around crime.
Yeah. Yeah, you would be shocked the number of Wikipedia scholarly sources I get, and they're like, well, my aunt posted this on Facebook, and I'm like, that's cute, but no, that's not what we're concerned about. It very well might be a true story, but when SNL, that's great. When you get into that funnel of that's my only source of information about crime and criminality, it gets very dangerous. So one of the things, Misty and I both teach our Introduction to Criminology course. And so we walk students through how do you get information that's accurate about crime, accurate as it can be, and how do we define the limits of that accurate information? Like Erica mentioned, her husband works in law enforcement. He writes reports. Those reports are then submitted. But what about people that never report to law enforcement? They don't feel comfortable reporting. What happens to all of that data? That's not really data. And then how do we collect it? So I thought it might be helpful to go through, again, just a very surface level. We're going a mile wide and an inch deep tonight, right? But so you can access this information if you so want to. But in the second half, we're going to talk a little bit more about the homicide rate and kind of what is happening as far as what's reported to law enforcement, and then we'll kind of move through. But a couple things that I wanted just to make sure that we're talking on, with the same information, the same verbiage. A couple ways that we as criminologists measure crime. So where do we look? If someone were to call me, for a media spot and say, hey, we need to talk about property crime or car burglaries in Kansas City, I would be able to pull up the UCR, NIBRS, and get that information relatively quickly. And I think sometimes people get really overwhelmed because they're like, well, I don't know anything about that. I haven't been trained, quote unquote, right? You're going to be trained by the end of this, right? Update the CV, here we go. But the UCR is called the Uniform Crime Report. And this is the big dog when we're talking about the statistics that are cited on, our big national news sources. This is typically where they're pulling that information. And it's important to note, vast majority of the time, they're talking about homicide. When they say major crimes, they're talking homicide rates. So the UCR is published by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It's annual. They have been publishing this report since 1930. So we're able to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges throughout the years, right? So this annual publication basically cleans, that's kind of an easy word to use, but it cleans all the data that is submitted from participating law enforcement agencies. And a couple of trigger words there, participating. So it has to be a law enforcement agency that said, yep, we're buying into the UCR, we're going to submit our reports. Law enforcement agency. So if you reported to your local rape crisis center and you access services, but you never reported to law enforcement, it's not going to be contained in the UCR. And the way that the UCR publishes their data is by incident and by rate of reported crime. So it is by far the most extensive and the most useful measure of crime, but only for those crimes that are reported. And it should also be noted that although the UCR is very useful for picturing crime in the United States, it is subject to unintentional and intentional error. So we have to have that in the back of our mind, right? So one of the ways that they report crime is the crime rate, and this is typically what we hear and what we see in popular media. So the crime rate is the number of crime indexed offenses divided by the population of that area. So we can look at the crime rate, we'll say the murder rate of Kansas City to St. Louis to Baltimore, right? And we'll do that here in a little bit. But it allows us to look at the rate per 100,000 people so we can compare. There are more homicides that take place in Chicago, but the homicide rate in Kansas City is higher. And that's important for a variety of reasons. UCR only uses the hierarchy rule. So your number one crime is the one that's going to be reported. It's up to law enforcement to determine what that number one crime is. So we have the UCR. It's relatively easy to pull up. We'll do that here in a little bit. But then we have what's called NIBRS, the NIBRS, and NIBRS gathers data on each criminal act, even if several acts are committed. So it's very rare, I'm sure Sarah could tell us, as a criminal defense attorney, it's very rare that criminals only commit one crime and then they walk away, right? Like they tend to mix it all up, and then people like Sarah are like, okay, so here's what we have. We have all of these things, and then move through the process. NIBRS is able to capture all of those crimes that took place. So because the UCR uses what we call the hierarchy rule when dealing with multiple offenses, only that highest offense is going to be reported. The rest are kind of ignored. I hate to say that. It's not that they didn't happen, but they're ignored for the UCR. And NIBRS compensates for the hierarchy rule. So they're like, we're going to take all of it and have it all within this report. So this is a fun activity. I say fun, I don't know. I think it's fun, where we can kind of see where is our understanding of crime in the United States. So just on a scratch piece of paper, we're going to be looking at your best guess for the following. So murder, in 2019, the estimated number of murders in the nation was, number 2, is this a percentage increase or a percentage decrease from 2018? And there were how many murders per 100,000, right? So when we walk away from this training, we'll be able to pull the UCR, look up that information. So this is what the UCR looks like. I'm going to put this up for a second, and then I'll go back to the first slide. But you can pull all this information today from the UCR and look and see, what the murder rate is in the United States. So does anyone want to venture a guess for the estimated number of murders in the United States for 2019?
I'm sorry, like a city or a state, or I missed something.
In the whole United States.
Okay, just how specific, like the state or just a city or?
No, the total for how many murders happened in the United States total.
Sorry.
No,
okay,
you're fine.
Got it.
We're moving quick. Any guess? 5,000, 50,000, 6,000. I had a student guess one time that there were 2 million. So, you don't know until you know, right? 24,000. You guys are right there, right? You're not that far off. So if you were to pull the UCR from the FBI, this is the report, how it looks on their website. There were 16,000 murders in the United States in 2019, 16,425. This was an increase, a very slight increase over 2018. And there were 5 murders per 100,000 in 2019. So remember that number, because that's important as we start to talk about what crime looks like in Kansas City, right? So overall, our crime rate, kind of our base level, is 5 per 100,000. If we pull down into robbery, how many robberies do you think took place in the entire United States in 2019? $45,000, 100,000, 250,000, 76,000. Awesome. You all overguessed. No, you were all right there. So 267,000 robberies took place in the United States. This was a 4.7% decrease from 2018, 27% decrease from 2010, which I think that's really important to note as well. And then the average amount that was stolen is about $2,000, $1,797. So why does this matter, right? Public perception of crime and what crime is taking place is really at odds with the data. So if we are able to say, hey, these are the media sources we look at, here's what I think crime is, and then you can compare it to a real data source, that's where we can start to make sense of, well, why is that? Am I hearing about crime that's not reported? Is that where I'm getting my information about crime? Is there some sort of bias within the reporting that I'm taking in? Why would that be? How could that happen? Are law enforcement in my community not receiving as many reports of a particular crime? Why could that be? Why does that matter, right? So it starts to look at what we call the dark figure of crime. So we have crimes that are known to police, the iceberg above the water, but we've got all this stuff that's happening under the water that we really need to be concerned with, because if we don't know what crime is taking place for whatever reason, right? So the offender could be a family member. The victim believes that it's trivial, or they don't want to make a fuss. They don't want to make a big deal about it. They may not trust the police. They may not want to report to the police. They could be concerned about their status as a person in the United States, their immigration status. Maybe they don't speak the language. They're concerned that that something's going to happen. Maybe they broke the law while a crime was perpetrated against them. So there are a lot of reasons. And when we start to see a huge discrepancy between crimes that are reported to law enforcement and then the information we're getting from other data sources, we can start to see that there may be an issue here, right? For whatever reason. So one of the data points that we can look at that's pretty, the reporting around it is pretty good, is going to be murder. So no major city in the United States has come close to Chicago. So they're soaring murder totals for the past few years. So the Windy City recorded about 1,900 homicides between 2015 and 2017. The next closest was Baltimore, which came in about 1,000. But when we take that number, the incidents, and we clean it for the crime rate, we can look at the fact that Chicago is by no means the murder capital, right, of the United States. And for decades, in fact, it has had fewer murders per capita than many other United States cities with smaller populations. And that's why data sources like the FBI are important, the UCR are important, because then you get to see these cities that may not have 1,900 murders, but they have a murder rate that's higher, right? St. Louis led the nation with 66 murders per 100,000, according to the FBI, obviously. Baltimore was at 55, 56. Detroit was like 39 or 40. New Orleans is 39. Kansas City ranked at 30. So we're not that far off. When you start to look at kind of where we fall within there, if you're looking at Kansas City, we're 30 per 100,000. This is looking at America's largest cities. Again, Kansas City isn't contained here, but I think it's important to note that while Chicago's murder rate is far from the highest in the nation, it's led the United States in the total number of murders. And that's why they tend to get that media recognition. And then we get in the back of our head, at least we don't have as many murders as Chicago, which is really detrimental because our rate is still pretty high. And this just outlines that. New York's murder rate, 3.4 homicides per 100,000. Kansas City's is 30. So yeah. So what is going on with crime in Kansas City from a larger perspective? I'm going to go ahead and skip over this just because we've already touched on it. When we look at crime in Kansas City, we're really looking, we can look holistically. We can pull up annual reports from different jurisdictions. It's difficult in Kansas City because we do have so many jurisdictions at play. So I'm going to I'm going to use Kansas City proper, Kansas City, Missouri proper as our example for here. But we can do this analysis for any city, any county in Kansas City Metro. So this is what's called the Daily Homicide Report. This is from Kansas City Police Department, kcpd.org. You can pull this up and you can see how many murders took place. So this is the end of the year report for 2020. So you'll notice on the top left side, the total number of homicides for 2020 was 176. If you scroll over 2019, we finished the year with 151, 2018, 138. So you can see there's a relatively significant jump between 2018 and 2020. So what was happening? What was happening in Kansas City? Why was that? You know, were there activities that were taking place within the police department, within you know, the area as a whole, Jackson County, that were impacting that? And why does that matter, right? A lot of times students will say, yeah, we don't have enough police, right? If we had more police, we would have a lower homicide rate. The police aren't doing enough. If you look at this, we're looking at, in the teal, homicides per 100,000. You'll notice Kansas City right there in the middle, right around 30. And then officers per 10,000. So we have quite a few officers for our city our size. You'll notice that when you're looking at an area like Chicago, yes, they have more police officers. They have more people within Chicago. So we have a relatively large, robust police department. And so when you're looking at crime, especially in Kansas City, it's not as simple as we need more officers. We have a lot. So what else can we be doing so that we're not looking at numbers like this, right? The reported crime numbers in Kansas City from the annual report, you know, you can, like I mentioned before, pull this for a lot of different jurisdictions in Kansas City and say, okay, how many of this particular crime took place? But it's really important to note in the back of your mind, these are just offenses known to law enforcement. So Misty will talk more about some organizations that are working with victims of crime that may be able to give a more holistic view of crime that's taking place, because victims will present to those agencies that have never reported their crime to law enforcement. And so it's important to have kind of everybody at the table and everybody offering up the information that they have so that we know. The one that sticks out to me, I used to work at the Rape Crisis Center in town. You'll notice that there were 209 reported rapes in Kansas City, Missouri in 2020. If you pull up MOXA, the Metropolitan Organization to Counter Sexual Assault, and you see how many victims they served last year, those numbers are not the same. People accessing services at a higher rate than the services that are, than the reports of sexual violence and sexual assault in Kansas City. So again, it all goes to kind of how we're looking at crime. Why does this matter? When we're looking at victims of crime, you know, how do we get their information? How does that come about? A couple different ways. The big one, the kind of premier example, would be the National Crime Victimization Survey. If you're looking at unreported crime, this is a great way to get information about that. 90,000 households participate, and they're attempting to measure the extent of crime by interviewing crime victims. So it's by the Census Bureau. Again, they've been doing this for a very long time, and they're able to compare year to year kind of what those rates look like. And then finally, self-report studies. So when you're looking at the UCR and NIBRS, that's someone reporting to law enforcement. When you're looking at the victimization survey, that's a victim that may never have reported to law enforcement. What about people that are perpetrating crime and their victims are not captured within the victimization survey, or their victims never knew they were a victim of crime? That's where we get into self-report. So you're talking to individuals that have committed crime. It's not filtered through the criminal justice system. A lot of students will say, why would anyone ever be honest on that? Well, because it's not like they're using that information to prosecute these individuals. And this provides a very accurate depiction of crime without having to view the behavior through the lens of law enforcement or through victims, or both, right? Who may introduce their own bias, either intentionally or unintentionally. It's the person that's perpetrating the crime that's saying, this is what I did. These are the crimes that I committed. So we can take all of that information and look at how we take in crime, what's happening in Kansas City, and then filter it through what I think is really important to a discussion, especially in Kansas City, of, so what is gun violence, right? What does gun violence look like? I'm going to stop my share so that Misty can share her screen and the slides that she has. And then I'll watch the chat for you, Misty, so you can lecture. Cool?
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
I'm going to treat this just like if we were in class and we just listened to a lot of statistics. So I want everybody to give their shoulders a little shake. I want you to roll your head around a little bit, right? Hopefully you're doing that when you sit at your desk at work too. We have to make sure that we stay loose. I'm going to go ahead and share so we can really start talking about, okay, now that we know more about how we measure crime, let's really start talking about gun violence, not because the other types of victimization don't matter, but because we know that gun violence, one, is just such a huge issue in Kansas City, but it also continues to be an area that people really struggle with understanding the victimization of. So really quickly, I just want to highlight a few different things for you. It's really important to note that it's not just Kansas City where we see a high level of gun violence. If you're comparing us to other countries, our rate of gun violence is incredibly high. Now, when people make that argument, it is always important to note we're not comparing apples to apples, right? Because each country engages with guns differently. They engage with measurements of gun violence differently. And so it's really important to note that distinction, but we can note that distinction and still be able to recognize that we have an incredibly high homicide rate. It's also important for us to consider where those homicides occur, okay? And what we know is that half of all gun homicides take place in the top 127 cities in America. And that only represents a fourth of the American population, okay? So half happening where 25% of us live, which means that if you're living in that area, you are experiencing this on a regular basis. We're not going to go to it today, but I did want to highlight for you and provide you some resources. And one of those is this interactive shooting map where you can really move around the country and see where those hot spots of gun violence are. And so as we progress and we talk more about community trauma, that'll become really important. It's also an interesting fact of American life that we simultaneously have more than half of the American population who has experienced or cares for someone who has experienced gun violence. And yet about 40% of Americans have a gun or live in a house with a gun, right? And so I think that sometimes we get this idea that talking about gun violence, we have to then go down a path of talking about getting rid of guns. And what I want to tell you is that I'm not here to talk about that with you. That's a whole other presentation that we can do. The reality is that most people, 40%, right? That's a huge chunk of our population. They have guns in their home, right? Simultaneously, right, we have over 50% of our people who also have experienced gun violence, which puts us in this tension, right, in talking about gun violence. It's also worth noting that it's relatively easy to get a gun in America, both illegally and legally. The average handgun is going to cost you about $200. The lower the quality, the less it costs, the higher the quality, right? But just keep that in mind. I'm going to take you guys to this site, if I can pull it up while I'm also on this. I just want to highlight the CDC has a really great tool for looking at the homicide, the firearm homicide rate in each state. And this map is really nice because let's say, I can look at Kansas, I can look at Missouri. Missouri has a bigger issue, right? We can see that by the color change. If I click on that, it'll actually tell me everything from the teen birth rate to the leading cause of death to how many firearm deaths are happening per 100,000. And I think that that's just really important for us to be thinking about. As we're talking about gun violence, I also want to make sure that we're keeping in mind that there are different classifications of homicides. Even if there wasn't an attorney on the call, I would make sure that I noted for you guys that I am not an attorney and that you should seek legal representation for interpretation of statutes. But I want to give you a basic overview of what these terms mean when you see it on the news. Okay, if we are talking about first-degree murder, we are talking about intentional and premeditated. If we're talking about second-degree murder, we're talking about something that lacks the premeditation but isn't always unintentional. Voluntary manslaughter, where the perpetrator is provoked and lashes out, okay? And then involuntary manslaughter, where we're thinking about like reckless things. So I always tell people, think about drunk driving, okay? And each state is going to define this slightly different. On the next slide, I've provided you guys links for the Kansas and Missouri statutes, but I just want you to have a frame of reference when you hear these different terms used, because a lot of people don't understand the difference between them, okay? Ultimately, we're always looking at that mental state when we're trying to decide how this is going to be ranked. Gun violence, like all other violence, right? It goes up during times of economic hardship. And that it goes up when the economy is doing bad. It also always goes up in the summer. And so when we're looking at crime rates, it's really important for us to consider those external factors as well. One of the biggest issues that law enforcement faces in terms of solving homicides is getting people to participate with them. So you hear a lot about clearance rates. How well are we clearing these homicides? And I always like to point out to people that, so often when we have that conversation, we're focused on law enforcement, but we're not necessarily focused on who is helping them, right? So they need witnesses to come forward. They need people in the community to partner with them. That becomes incredibly difficult when the confidence in that police department goes down. And then we start moving on this cycle where it's like, well, I don't trust the police, so I'm not going to participate. Well, because the community is not participating, now we don't have the help we need to clear these. Our clearance rate goes down. The community looks at that and goes, they don't care about us enough to clear those, right? And then we end up in this horrible cycle. What we know is that this is particularly true right now. For the first time since we started asking Americans this question, right? How confident do you feel in the police? For the first time since we started collecting that, it has gone below 50%, okay? 48% of Americans in 2020 and a national Gallup poll said that they feel a great deal of confidence or quite a lot of confidence in their local police. That is going to have an impact on our clearance rates. It just is, right? And so when we start thinking about our community and why people struggle with responding to gun violence, with engaging in partnerships, it's really important to understand that that has a tangible impact on our ability to prevent and respond to crime. So I'm not going to click on these for you guys, but I did want to make sure that you had them so that you could go and look at them. I want to show you guys what this looks like in Kansas City for gun violence here. So if you're looking at the orange, what you're looking at there is just simply the 5-year average. And then this blue is 2020. Now, to be fair, we anticipate that violence would have gone up in 2020. The economy was doing bad, the pandemic hit, right? There's an expectation that crime would go up then and that crime will also go up in 2021. There should be a baseline acceptance of that, not in the terms of we accept violence to happen, but that it's expected, right? With how the economy is doing. Also would highlight for you guys this huge spike that we had in the summer in 2020. So if we're thinking about Kansas City, I know that Lindsay touched on this. I just want to highlight for you guys, Kansas City did see a significant increase in the number of homicides in terms of the raw number, but it's also important to note that nationally homicide rates went up 20 to 22%. So we saw a 19% increase, which was really horrible for us because we already had a really high rate, okay? But in terms of that expected move, that it makes sense that we saw that 19% increase. I do want to highlight, just like Lindsay highlighted, the number of police that we have with the number of homicides that exist. Sometimes there's this idea that, of course, we have a really high homicide rate because we have a really high population size. And I want you to know that that's not always true, right? 2019, the city of Seattle, they have a population of about 775,000. Significantly higher than our population in 2019 of 450,000. And yet they saw 332 total shootings and 18 fatal shootings. So 18 compared to our 145, despite the fact that their population is significantly higher than ours. And so when we're talking about gun violence in Kansas City, while we have to consider what that looks like with all the other variables of the economy and the pandemic involved, it's also incredibly important to note that we still have an incredibly high homicide rate for the population size that we have. Additionally, we have an overwhelming majority of those victims being Black males, right? And so we can look at that and we can talk about population and demographics, but nationally what we know is that this is a part of a national conversation that we need to have in regards to who is harmed by guns and how are we going to address that issue. In particular, what does that look like at the community level? We talked about clearance rates, so I do want to highlight for you guys that the national clearance rate is about 61%. And in 2020, KCMO cleared 73%, right? So we're well above the national clearance rate. A lot of people want to jump into Operation Legion. Here's what I will tell you. It created a lot of controversy. They did have 33 suspects that they arrested, and the total number of people that'll be charged from that is still unknown. But people have lots of different feelings about it, and that's important for us to consider when we think about how the community responds to gun violence, because some people were very angry that the feds came in, and some people were very excited about having that extra support. And so we really, when we're thinking about how should the community respond to this, it's important that we're holding that tension for people, for the people who want to put more resources in terms of a law enforcement response out into the community, and the people who are not willing or wanting to do that. Do we have a question? Okay. So really quickly, some of you may be really familiar with ACEs, some of you might not. Before we jump into the community piece, I just want to highlight this study and the value that comes from it. So really quickly, does anybody on the call know what an ACE is? You can unmute yourself, put it in the chat, whichever feels most comfortable to you. So an ACE is going to be an adverse childhood experience. This is a study that we started in the 1990s and is still continuing today. It is a study that originally was looking at the impact of childhood experiences on the health outcomes of middle class, middle-aged white males. Okay, and what they found was that when you had 4 or more of these ACEs, you had a significant increase in the physical manifestations of that trauma in your body. Okay, we saw an increase in heart disease. We saw an increase in asthma. We saw an increase in depression and anxiety issues. And so when we're thinking about how does this exposure to gun violence influence people and how might it influence them throughout the life course, the ACE study becomes really important. So I always tell people, I really want you guys to know what your ACE score is. So I'm gonna pull this up for you guys. So this is the Adverse Childhood Experience website for the CDC, and that's included in your link. But really quickly, I want to take you through the actual quiz. And so can everybody see my screen that's been switched and there's a little blue box on it? Yes, okay, thank you, Erica, I appreciate that. So I'm gonna click us through this, and I just want you to make a little tally. Okay, make a little tally on a piece of paper next to you. If you answer yes, how many you answer yes to and how many you answer no to, okay? So before your 18th birthday, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? So I'm gonna let you mark that down, yes or no. Question 2, before your 18th birthday, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Before your 18th birthday, did an adult or a person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you or have you touch their body in a sexual way or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Yes or no? Before your 18th birthday, did you often or very often feel like no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Before your 18th birthday, did you often or very often feel like you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you, or that your parents were too drunk or too high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? Before your 18th birthday, was a biological parent ever lost to you through divorce, abandonment, or other reasons? Before your 18th birthday, was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes often or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes, or threatened with a gun or a knife? We're almost done. Before your 18th birthday, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or used street drugs? Before your 18th birthday, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Before your 18th birthday, did a household member go to prison? So, what do you guys think about that? About the questions, about what that might tell us?
I think I thought that it was impactful that this is something that that people can answer, like it says on here, 4 or more. I mean, I think it gives me pause about, I guess the privilege that I had, even though my score wasn't 0, but it's amazing that this is something that is a regular issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lexi.
I think in my case, I had 4. But in my case, it's not being necessarily perpetrator of a crime, but I have been a victim too, since, well, after the age of 18, I've been in an abusive relationship. So,
yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Ash.
Mhm.
So I will tell you guys, what we know is that about 61% of the adults they surveyed across 25 states had at least one type of ACE. and nearly 1 in 6 had experienced 4 or more. When I do this in my classes, so I do the ACE study in my advocacy and crisis intervention class, in my human trafficking class, and in my restorative justice class. And even though our students represent all over, right, a vast majority of our students are from the area. And I have yet to do a class at UMKC where an overwhelming majority, and when I say overwhelming majority, I'm talking like 75 to 85% do not have 4 or more. It's incredibly common for me to see a class where multiple students have all of the ACEs, right? And that becomes important when we're having conversations with these students about the community and the community response to violence and how much how they feel cared for, right? Because ultimately, if I'm experiencing all of this trauma, right, and now I go out into the world and I'm trying to make a difference, and I'm surrounded by all these people who maybe don't have those ACEs, right? It makes it incredibly hard to navigate that space successfully. Additionally, if we don't have resources in the community to help people deal with those ACEs, the original study really focused on health outcomes, but what we also know is that ACEs are tied deeply into juvenile delinquency. ACEs are tied deeply into our recidivism rate for our adult offenders once they're released, right? And an overwhelming majority of offenders will be released from prison, right? And yet we send them there and we don't address those ACEs at all. And then we put them back in the community with the added trauma of the prison experience, right? And so what I tell people is, regardless of your feelings about how prison should be used, if a majority of people are going to be released, we should hope that we're trying to help those people be better once they come back into our communities, right? And so this ACE is a really good way of getting a baseline for what are we talking about here when we talk about significant traumas. I also want to add for you guys, even though we don't have time to do it in this presentation, there is something called a resiliency score. And I would encourage you to go take your resiliency score as well. I always want to let anybody who does the ACE study know that, because what we know is that what goes right in your life, especially as a child, always matters more than what goes wrong. So I will tell you, I have 8 ACEs. I was a foster kid, right? And so I always pull that resiliency score out and I talk with people about not only what strengths do they have that they are bringing to their community, but how can we seek out the strengths and the values of the people that are already existing in that community? If we can look around the classroom, right? If I can look around a group of people in a presentation and say, look at the average ACE score here and look at all that you have still accomplished. What would it look like if when we go into these communities, instead of looking at them and saying, man, look at how bad the homicide rate is. How would it be different if we stepped into that community and we looked around and we said, look at how resilient this community is. Even with all of this, look at the ways in which you're still trying to show up for each other, the ways in which you're still committed to grassroots activism, right? The ways in which you're showing up to try and make things better for each other. That's incredibly important for us to focus on. So when we think about ACEs and we think about the impact of gun violence, what we know is that if you experience multiple types of trauma over an extended period of time, you experience what we call complex trauma. And complex trauma increases the risk of post-traumatic stress disorder. Additionally, we know that children who grow up in those high violence neighborhoods, they experience complex trauma, which impacts their neural pathways. Okay, so this is the idea of what fires together stays together. Have you ever met somebody that you're like, man, you just keep making the same bad choices, right? And it just blows your mind because you're like, what is happening here? Well, what we know is that the more we engage in negative coping skills, the more our body just wants to go to that, right? Our brain has associated that with our response. And so it's really important for us to dive into that, especially at a young age, because when we're young, we can definitely learn new tricks when we get older, right? But when we're young, it's much easier, right? So it's far easier to address trauma in a child than it is to address trauma that is built up over the course of a lifetime in an adult, Okay. And when we have this complex trauma that's tied to growing up in a high violence neighborhood, so this isn't just about my ACE score, right? But if I'm in a community where everybody around me has a high ACE score, none of us are functioning at our best, right? And so my community support is going to be lower. The patience that people in my home, in my community are going to have with me, that's going to be lowered. The ACE questions, they don't ask you things like, when was the last time that you saw somebody killed? But I will tell you, I can ask that question to any group in Kansas City, and there's going to be somebody in that room who's going to tell me, oh, last night, last week, right? What does it look like when we have youth who are walking through neighborhoods where there's all sorts of rules about how to engage in that neighborhood? And they have to manage all of that along with trying to go to school, along with managing their individual trauma. And so, we had this movement to say, hold on, we really need to think about what it looks like to grow up in a community where there is this overwhelming sense of everybody having a high rate of violence exposure. And the term that we have come up with that is community trauma, okay? And Pendergast came up with this. If you search up community trauma, you'll find all sorts of TED Talks about him. Definitely go read his material. Ultimately, what he's talking about here is this prolonged exposure to stress, the stress of simply trying to navigate in your neighborhood safely decreases the brain's executive function, right? So the part that helps you make good choices, the part that helps you, if you think back to the start of the presentation where Lindsey is talking about, making that rational decision, the part of your brain that helps you do that is significantly impacted and it deteriorates as a result of this trauma exposure and this community violence. Right. And so then we have, children who grow up to be juveniles and young adults who are engaging in criminal behavior, and we're trying to provide supports and we're trying to figure out, why aren't you receiving this well? Because their brain has been fundamentally altered as a result of this trauma. Now, the great thing about this is that it doesn't have to stay that way, right? People are incredibly resilient and we have lots of tools available to us to help people, but we can't do that if we're not first acknowledging that it's not just about what happens to you at the individual level, it's also about what's happening in the community around you. So when we're thinking about the trauma that can happen, what we know is if you witness violence on multiple occasions, okay, multiple occasions being listed as 3 or more on a regular basis, okay, you score 7 points lower on IQ test, 10 points lower on reading comprehension, and longitudinal studies, so studies that take place over the span of 10, 15, 20 years, will tell us that those gaps continue to persist. So these children are set up for doing worse on the things that help us progress and move ourselves up in terms of mobility. We also know that, if I have this high trauma score, right, and I'm living in a neighborhood with high trauma, and my supports are lacking, and I can't go talk to my neighbor or my community's best friend, right, about the trauma I'm experiencing because they have their own stuff, they have their own trauma. Well, then I don't have anywhere to process that. And so then what happens when I have a child who experiences trauma, or when I just have a kid being a kid? I don't know about you guys. I have 2 children right now. Okay. And there are days where there's nothing horrible that's happened. I'm just really annoyed. Okay. What does that look like for the parent who's also trying to deal with all of their own stuff and they don't have anybody helping them with that? Right. And so we end up with higher rates of child abuse and high rates of emotional neglect, not because we have parents who don't want to be good parents, but because they're trying to figure out all their own stuff too, okay? And so, when we have all of these things happening, then we might have a parent who has a violent outburst at home. That child goes to school, they have a violent outburst at school, and then what happens? We have a school resource officer who makes an arrest. And that's not to say that there are limitations, right, on school resource officers. I share that because we really have to think about how all of this trauma in the community setting and in the home setting then bleeds out into other parts of the community. so what does that look like then, right? If we're thinking about all the spokes of the wheel, we're talking about difficulty in school, we're talking about an increase in those high-risk behaviors because I already have all these ACEs. I've already had all these bad things happen to me. Nobody cares about me. Nobody cares about the violence in our community. I cannot tell you the number of times I have heard people say that, like, I'm not even going to bother reporting to the police because nobody cares. Everybody just expects this kind of stuff to happen here, right? And so we start to see this increase in high risk behaviors because people just don't feel like they have anything left to lose. Additionally, nobody wants to invest in it, right? And so we know that, you know, you might be in a community, if there's high rates of violence, your places of employment may be limited to the pawn shop, the fast food restaurant, and the payday loan place, right? And maybe the liquor store. We don't even have high quality grocery stores in that area. I'm so glad, by the way, you guys are going to talk about food deserts. It plays into crime on such a high level, and I'm so excited that you're going to talk about it. But people don't want to come into those communities then. And so then they fall into more disarray. Additionally, we have an increase in the number of people engaging in the criminal justice system. And then you just simply miss out on what's called the Walkability Score, right? I don't know about you guys. I love taking a walk around my neighborhood, right? I consider that like the beacon of success for me, that I can take my kids and we can just walk around the neighborhood and they can ride their bike around the neighborhood and we can just enjoy the outdoors. What does that look like in communities where it's not possible to do that? We not only do we see an increase in obesity and in unhealthy eating habits in those areas as a result of the food desert, but we also have it in terms of just not having a safe place to engage out in the community. So when you think about the impact of gun violence, I want you to think about all these different spokes and how they play to each other. When we think about the distinct forms of trauma, community trauma is officially recognized as a form of trauma, okay? It is a collective experience of living with fear of violence. When we are trying to figure out how do we get community buy-in, we want to solve this issue of violence in the community. It is incredibly important that when we go into those communities, we are recognizing that there is a generational acceptance of this community trauma, right? That there is this idea of it's always happened here, and the only way to escape it is if you leave the neighborhood. Think about how disheartening that is. And so when we're coming into those communities, we really do need to make sure that we're focusing on the resiliency of them while also acknowledging that there's a lot of hurt there and a lot of broken promises, right? Where people came in and they said they were going to do all these things and then the violence remained. And so then people look at new initiatives, right? No matter how good they may be, and they're like, no, thank you, right? Because they don't want to get their hopes up. They don't want to believe that change is possible just to simply have it fall apart again. And so part of our job in terms of reducing violence is simply helping people feel hopeful about the fact that it's possible and that we do care about the trauma that they are experiencing. So what might this look like, right? So we have isolation from neighbors and peers. This is people who just simply don't call the police, right? I'm not going to get involved. I don't care. I don't want to be a part of that. Encouragement of violence as a protective factor. So if you want to really go back into it, you could go read Elijah Anderson's Code of the Streets from 1994, where he talks about this, right? He talks about the idea that parents will teach their children to engage in violence as a method of protecting themselves. It's either be bullied or be the bully kind of thing, right? The hopelessness that we just talked about, that fear of retaliation if I engage with the police, while simultaneously pairing that with a fear of the authorities. The only time I see the authorities is when they're coming in to take somebody away, and now I don't know if that's safe, right? And then at the system level, we see both sides of the same coin happening here, right? We have people who live in that area who have a strong disregard for authorities because they're like, you know what, that trust is eroded. But by the same token, like that trust is eroded, but we do want you to come in and stop the violence. And it becomes this sticky point of, well, how do we do that? And that requires really tough conversations that are sometimes difficult to get people to engage in. And additionally, if I come in and I am really hopeful about helping to make change, and I came on board because I wanted to be in this profession to help people, and then I go into that community and they don't want me and they don't like me, right? And so now I'm like, okay, well, where's my sense of hope come in? And that's not, I want to be really clear, that's not to say that there aren't really valid reasons why people in a community are hesitant and frightened to work with our first responders, because that is very, very real. But it's also really important for us to understand that that creates a high level of tension in trying to address community violence. And the biggest way that we can address that is by being willing to have really honest conversations about past harms and current harms, and transparency, and really trying to build up that trust with each other. The other thing is simply a lack of resources and that triage of highest need. Okay. So what's the response time like? What we know is that people strongly correlate response times with how much they feel like people care about them. And that's not, it's not always a matter of, we just didn't respond because we didn't want to, right? But people will internalize that. And so we have to be really mindful. You've probably seen in the news, there's been a lot of coverage about the process of 911 in Kansas City. And that becomes a huge part of the conversation about how do people feel. That the difficulties with getting through to 911, that's not law enforcement's fault, but that's absolutely how it's internalized. And so trying to think through, how do we address the issues and the challenges with our different portions of community response, while also making sure that people understand the right people to hold accountable for that. But we have resiliency. So we can identify the leaders in our community, okay? The biggest thing I can tell you is just simply that we should be doing nothing for a community without it, right? I am not an expert on Kansas City because I don't live here, right? I don't live in these neighborhoods. And so it's incredibly important that if I'm going to be doing any work, that I'm understanding that I'm a guest in that community and that my job is to listen, right? And to build bridges with those who are already doing the work, and to recognize that my truth is not always going to be their truth. And how do I listen to the harms and challenges that they're facing in a way that's really respectful, in a way that allows me to help bridge relationships between our first responders and the community? How can I make sure that I'm amplifying the voices of people who are sharing the places where they're hurt, the places where they need accountability, the places where they need people across the community to engage? So if we're looking at these thrive factors here, and these are areas that we've identified are key for violence prevention, right? What I will tell you is you'll know that this isn't just focused on those within the criminal justice realm. If we want to reduce violence, we have to move beyond just looking at the punitive pieces of it. We have to think about what's the value of education in that community, and is it an education system that works and that people feel good about, right? What kind of wages can people make? Where can they get employment? How do we make sure that there are adequate homes for people, and that those homes are upkept in a way that can make people feel proud to be part of that community? How do we increase the parks and open spaces and make them safe places? Because, we can build a park, but if it's not safe to go there, it doesn't really help us, right? And so just trying to think through what are some of these factors that we can take into play. And what I can tell you is that in Kansas City, we're working on really addressing this idea that violence prevention is a cohesive response, that violence prevention is a public health issue, and that we have to treat it that way instead of putting it in the little silo of here's criminal justice, right? And so what does that look like at our community? The first place that I want to make sure that I talk to you guys about is KC Common Good. And so KC Common Good is really looking at finding a way to take all of this good stuff that we're doing in the community and all of these people that are doing good work and putting all of their data into one space, right? So that we can see what's working and what's not, what's helpful in one neighborhood versus a different neighborhood. But additionally, looking at how can we use what other people have done and implement that here. So for instance, in Omaha, they have this project called Omaha 360, and they've significantly reduced homicides in Omaha, Nebraska, as a result of looking at all those things that I just talked to you about, right? As a result of coming in and saying, look, we can't just talk about criminal justice reform if we want to make our communities safer. We also have to talk to people about their education system. We also have to make sure that they have access to mental health services. We need to make sure we're talking to them about trauma. We need to make sure that they have access to grocery stores that can provide for their needs without being astronomically high, right? And so KC Common Good is rather new. I want to say, Lindsay, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I want to say they're about 2 years old. And they're just doing really, really great work and partnering with a lot of different people. Additionally, we have the Reform Project, KC, and that's an initiative stemming out of the mayor's office where they're working on 4 different pillars in regards to increasing community support and really reforming the criminal justice system in Kansas City. So everything from focusing on municipal charges and those administrative pieces to increasing trust with law enforcement communities. So they're really looking at how do we break all these issues up and put them into different categories that we can have specialists focus on. I also will tell you that KC Mothers in Charge is a fantastic organization. If you're looking for a simple way to get involved, they'll be holding Pee Wee's Run virtually this year on April 17th. So Rosalind Temple is the executive director there, and her son Pee Wee was killed in his apartment, and they have yet to find the person who killed him. And so the run is named after him. Mothers in Charge is a national group. They have chapters all over, but this is our local one. They respond to the scene of homicides to work with the families. They offer support groups. So really getting back to that idea of how do we address trauma, right? And so it's free support groups for people who have lost loved ones, particularly mothers who have lost loved ones to violence. And they're really focused on building bridges and connections between the community and law enforcement and making sure that we are addressing that hurt that people are experiencing. Additionally, I listed a few others for you. You have Aim for Peace. That's a group working on homicides. The Center for Conflict Resolution is one that a lot of people don't know about, but it's a really cool organization in Kansas City that works on teaching conflict resolution skills in our primary schools all the way up to working with parolees and working in the prisons on conflict resolution. They have neighborhood accountability boards where if we have a juvenile who's engaging in some delinquent acts, or maybe you have a neighbor who won't follow city ordinances, instead of going through the court system, they can go through a neighborhood accountability board and really work on this idea of a restorative justice approach. So they're also a really excellent group. And then we have the Kansas City NOVA No Violence Alliance. So how do you help? We just gave you all of this information. What are you supposed to do with it, right? The first thing I'm going to tell you is we really need to combat myths around gun violence and the images that we see. I put this picture in here because regardless of how you might feel about guns, we really need to think about the messages that we send about what owning a gun does for you and how that's tied into a personality, right? And I say that, you guys, as a person who owns guns, right? So this isn't a conversation about not liking guns or not wanting guns. It's a conversation about how do we talk about guns? How do we talk about gun ownership with people? And what are the messages that we're sending, especially to our youth, about owning and utilizing guns and showing guns to others? The other thing around this idea of gun violence is what we call the just world fallacy. And the just world fallacy is this idea that bad things only happen to people who deserve it, even if we don't think fully they deserve it, right? So this isn't a, well, you deserve to die because you must be a horrible person. The ways in which we use just world fallacy are far more insidious anymore, right? And so it's, well, if you don't like the gun violence there, you could leave. right? You don't have to stay in that community. It's, you know, victim one day, perpetrator the next, right? Those are all ways in which we engage in this just world fallacy. The idea that if you are experiencing gun violence, there must be something that you did to slightly contribute to it. And so if we can really frame that conversation differently, especially considering the number of youth and children who are exposed to gun violence, we're going to go a long way in building that trust and really starting to work towards prevention. Additionally, we simply need more space for youth to engage and develop pro-social behaviors, right? We need things for them to do. We need to support after-school activities. We need to support athletics. We need to support community centers. We need places for youth to go, right? And be around other people who are not engaging in violence. Additionally, increasing awareness and opportunities to obtain gun locks is huge, right? You can get gun locks for free in a lot of different places, but people don't know that. And so making sure that we're engaging in those conversations, increasing conflict resolution training for youth, right? Making sure that people know before they become adults, how do you manage conflict effectively? And I don't know about you, but even as an adult, I meet people where I'm like, somebody really should teach you conflict resolution skills, right? What would it look like if we incorporated that into our classrooms? And then, of course, providing your time, talent, and or treasure to local groups doing anti-gun violence work. The places that I just listed on the other slide, all are great places for you to get involved. Additionally, I want to highlight for you guys that we have a handout for you that'll have these things listed for you as well. And, you know, just continue to educate yourself. So we have a handout that has a lot of different resources on it for you. And so I want to make sure that you know that and that you can continue to build upon this conversation, because I recognize that everybody coming here tonight is at a different level of understanding. And so that resource list has 4 different books for you. It has 2 podcast episodes. And then it has some things that you can watch, and again, list the places in Kansas City that you could get involved. I did want to highlight for you guys, if you really want to dive into the rates of gun violence and what that looks like, every town has some really great resources on it. And then the Prevention Institute additionally has some great stuff. This is a really great podcast episode on building up communities to respond to gun violence in an effective way. And then this is it's a rather long YouTube webinar, recorded webinar on looking at gun violence through a public health lens. So that's what I have for you. I want to take some time to stop, really engage with you, answer questions that you have. Like Lindsay said, we were going a mile wide and an inch deep, so I realized that we probably didn't answer all of your questions, but we built time in for that. And so I want to take the next bit of time. You can ask a question as it relates to anything we've covered in the PowerPoint. If you're like, no, I have a very specific question, I attended tonight to ask it, you go ahead. Like, we work with college students, so you could, you know, start doing cartwheels and asking me a question. I would not be fazed. So we are here and we really want to provide you what you need.
So I have a question about the confidence and clearance.
Yeah.
We talked about. So that was one statistic that I was like, oh my gosh, Kansas City is actually doing something right. Does that mean that we also have positive confidence in our police force? Because everything else pointed to maybe not.
Yeah, so there are some police departments that do a really good job collecting data on community approval. For instance, Lenexa has one of the highest in the country. They have a 94% community approval rate. So like, I know, right? Like, somebody please go do some data in Lenexa. Let's copy it, right? Kansas City does not fully collect data on this community satisfaction. And so it's really hard to know what that looks like. I think there's some give and pull there, right? The clearance rate being so high should make us happy, right? We should feel good about that, especially considering it's higher than the national average. So when people talk about, oh, Kansas City police don't care about homicides, you are not clearing at that level without people being really committed to their work. And so I think it's really important whenever we're going to talk about things that we can improve upon, it's also really important that we acknowledge good work that's being done. And that's a big part of it. In terms of how the community feels, I think one of the areas of tension that we're still struggling with in the city is this idea of local control and who manages the police and who gets a say in it. And so that tension, I think, contributes to our inability to really effectively measure how do people feel about the police. I will say in Kansas City, if you submit a complaint about a police officer, and there's lots of rules, you can go look it up on their website. They do have a board that convenes and looks at that. And so that's a little bit different than some of our other cities. So that's a really long-winded way of saying we don't actually have a statistical number we can give you about community satisfaction because they don't do that. Now, it is my understanding that part of what the Reform Project is doing is getting to a point where we can do that survey for the city and get a good baseline feel for that. So I couldn't give you a statistical answer on that, but what I can tell you is that the clearance rate is high. That does show to a certain extent a level of trust. And really up until this summer, we have experienced an engagement with law enforcement that a lot of other cities don't have, right? And so that's really important for us to think about as well. And of course, because we're criminologists, we're always like, okay, let's talk about what happened this summer then, right? Because it influences things. And so, in terms of building that community trust, the biggest thing that I hear from community members when I engage with them is they've promised us a lot before. And so the lack of trust really comes from, you keep telling us you're going to help and then nothing changes. And so then people just stop engaging, right? It's like the friend who always says you're going to get together and then you don't. And you're like, fine, I'll let you hit me up when you want to get coffee, right? I feel like that's where the community is at right now. They're like, bring the coffee and we'll see. And so that's kind of the space that we're holding right now.
Well, it's also worth noting, a lot of those agencies that Misty outlined in one of the last slides, they are lending their ability to the police department to also bolster, especially, I don't want to speak out of turn or speak for Rosalind Temple, who is with Kansas City Mothers in Charge, but I've heard her say this enough that I feel comfortable sharing it in here. She responds to homicides, she doesn't work, quote unquote, for the police department, but her good acts and her ability to say, look, my son's homicide is unsolved and we got to work with the police department to get these homicides solved. That helps the community get on board with law enforcement too. So while law enforcement is doing what they need to do from a technical procedural point, they also have to engage with these community groups because that also assists them as well. So when you see a lot of community groups participating with law enforcement, that also lends me from a criminologist perspective to see there's a good relationship there. Because community groups, they don't have to work with law enforcement, they're doing that because they believe in the process. Where we start to get concerned is where community groups are usurping or moving around law enforcement. That's where Misty and I start to ask questions like, why is that? Why are community groups now refusing to participate with law enforcement? And that's concerning. A low clearance rate is concerning, and a police department that doesn't have any local community agencies working with them is extremely concerning. So the fact that we have multiple agencies that are working closely with law enforcement, Kansas City PD, not only speaking to them, but others throughout the jurisdiction, it's worth noting.
And that's not to say that they're not without flaws, because I mean, I don't know about you, but would you say that your workplace is without flaws? Most of us would not, right? So there's definitely still flaws, and part of our obligation to the community is to make sure that we partner with them in addressing those flaws, and that we're providing the support and resources that our first responders need to address those effectively, and making sure that we're amplifying those concerns, right? So that is always important for us to do. I do want to highlight, Catherine asked a question, why do you think some police don't take initial crimes as seriously as they could? For instance, once a person goes missing, they don't make an immediate search, claim it's a runaway, that sort of thing. It's really important to understand the triage process that they're going through. So for instance, but in the case of a missing person, especially if it's an adult or a teenager, we're first just trying to figure out, did somebody get mad and just storm off, right? Because there are a lot of people that engage in that, right? And so we have to make sure that we don't initiate this huge search for somebody who maybe just simply took off because they were upset. Additionally, I will tell you, in terms of adults, one of the things people miss is that people leave for a lot of reasons, and sometimes they're leaving for safety reasons. And so if you call me and you say, hey, my wife left and she's not been back for 16 hours, well, maybe your wife left because you're abusive and she's trying to get to safety, right? So some of that has to do with us just trying to make sure that first of all, that these people really truly are missing, and that they didn't just leave for safety. Or, you know what, sometimes I fantasize about just leaving, especially when I have to think about what's for dinner for, the 50,000th time, right? And so, thinking through that, right? And I'm not trying to make light of people leaving home, but people do. They take off sometimes for a day or two for all sorts of different reasons. And sometimes it's a silly reason, and sometimes it's a serious reason. But the law enforcement really has to weed through that first. When it's somebody who's under 18, especially as a teenager, what we're trying to assess is this person in immediate danger? And, I will tell you, as somebody who has a 15-year-old, if my child was not home, I'm like the hyper texter mom, right? So like, if she wasn't home right when she needed to be, I'd be like, she's gone, somebody's taken her, right? But we really have to assess, like, what's the risk here? Because we do have only a certain amount of resources available. And additionally, they're also trying to gather data and information. Are there cameras that we can look at? I will tell you, if you're in Kansas City, I think I was told that you're on camera, what is it, like 30 times a day, Lindsay?
Yeah.
And so we have to sift through that stuff. So I really do think that part of this, why don't we respond immediately? Sometimes they are responding immediately. It's just not always in ways that we can see. That's a great question. Anybody else? Your most pressing question. Yeah, no problem.
So what made both of you go into criminology?
Great question. I originally was going to be a meteorologist, and then I discovered how much science is in that. And so I started as a sociology major in college, and then went to law school in Michigan, and always found myself really focusing on the fact pattern instead of the law that's applied, and really focused on, well, what happened to the victim? What happened to the victim? And my law professors were so annoyed with me, because it's like, it doesn't matter what law was applied. And so I then came to UMKC to get my master's in criminology, because I was really concerned with how we were talking about crime victims, their role within the process, how they aren't involved sometimes. 95% of criminal cases are resolved through a plea agreement, and at varying levels of interaction with the victim. So I was very concerned with, what does policy and procedure look like with victims? And the way to study that for me was through the criminology lens at UMKC.
So for me, I always knew I wanted to work with people who had experienced some type of violence. I was a real weird little kid. And when I first started college, I thought I wanted to be a defense attorney. Like, I was like invested in it, right? And then I started volunteering at the local rape crisis center. I was like, man, I really love working with people who are hurting. Like, that is the most rewarding thing to me. And so, I was doing that work, and I ended up coming to UMKC and doing my master's in criminology, because when I was doing advocacy work, the advocates in the communities I was working in, like, they hated law enforcement and law enforcement hated them. And I was like, wait a second, guys, shouldn't we be playing on the same team? And so I really went to grad school, probably not the best way to make a financial decision, because I was like, I need to know more. I need to understand the why. And so, here I am, all this debt, but like, now I feel like I've got a better understanding of the why, and I just have lots more whys, right? Because that's what happens when you start digging into this, is you're like, oh, now there's just so many additional questions to ask. And so that's really what led me into doing the work and being invested in it. And as I continue to grow and do that work, I continue to look at the ways in which my area of focus in particular is on the ways in which race and gender and class impact our views of crime and how we interact with it. And so, when you're working with the community and you're seeing all of those layers in terms of not only victimization, but how people feel about the systems and the ways those systems are causing harm to them, that became really important to me. And so that's really fueled a lot of the work that I do.
I have a question. Misty, you briefly mentioned kind of the school to prison pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain a little bit more about that and what we can possibly do and what steps we can take to prevent that?
Ooh, oh man, do we have another 2 hours? Let me see if I can really get this quick for you. I love this conversation. So really quickly, when people are talking about the school to prison pipeline, what we're really talking about is that we have created this funnel in our attempts to create order in schools. We have created this funnel where from a very young age, we are involving people in the criminal justice system in ways that we didn't before, to the extent where we can even look at preschool, right, and see interactions with the criminal justice system from that age. Additionally, I would be remiss in my 2 hours crunched down to 2 minutes if I didn't acknowledge that there is a deep gender and racial element to this, right? And so what we know is even at the preschool level, if you are a youth who is part of an underserved population, in particular, if you are part of the Black community or the Latinx community, you engage with the criminal justice system even at the preschool level at a higher point. We're far more likely to call the police in for unruly behavior. So if you're thinking back to that slide where I talked about, the anger outbursts and my prefrontal cortex is hurting because of all that trauma, instead of responding to that in a trauma-informed way, we're simply calling law enforcement. And some of that is just the overwhelmed school system too, right? Some of that is simply, I'm a teacher with 40 to 50 kids in this classroom, and I just need to manage it and move on because we've got a lot to learn. What we also know is that we implemented school resource officers in as a way to really provide a sense of safety. But then what happened is, where it used to be that maybe we just send you to the principal's office, well, now we have this person here that we can send you to, right? And so now all of a sudden, where it might have been handled within the school, now it's being handled by a representative of the criminal justice system. And so we see this increase in the number of youth who are in school and then are moving from school to prison or moving from school to juvenile delinquency centers as a direct result of that implementation of additional criminal justice supports within the school. And so if we're trying to think, and that's the really, really short, I'm making somebody who studies this very upset, I'm sure, in the universe. But if we're trying to find a way to address that, I think there are some things that we need to do. My area is trauma, so I'm always trying to bring it back to that. But the reality is that if people understood trauma more and we were teaching our teachers how to engage in that. So for instance, in schools where they implemented daily meditation and yoga, we saw a significant decrease in the number of youth who were sent to the principal's office and the number of youth who were sent to school resource officers. Because here's the thing, just the very basic tenet of teaching people how to breathe, right? I'm going to give you a lesson in this real quick because we all need reminders. I'm going to teach you the lesson of 5. I'm really upset, right? And so in that moment, have you ever had somebody make you real mad at work and you all of a sudden feel your blood pressure going up? right? And you're trying to remind yourself you're a professional and that you need to pay your bills. Okay. In that moment, right, we can practice the rule of 5 and we can teach kids this. So the rule of 5 is I'm going to breathe in for 5 seconds, hold for 5 seconds, and release for 5 seconds. And I'm going to do that 5 times. Okay. So if we're going to do this together. Are you ready? We're going to breathe in for 5 seconds. You're going to hold for that 5 seconds. And then you're going to release for those 5 seconds. Now, how many of you had trouble breathing in for the full 5 seconds and you started to wonder if you had COVID, right? You're like, right? Okay. We don't breathe well as a people, guys. We hold our breath a lot. You feel that in your shoulders. Have you ever been sitting and you realize that you've been pressing your tongue against the top of the roof of your mouth because you're just trying so hard not to say something inappropriate, right? We stop breathing well in that moment. If you're not breathing well, you're not thinking well. Okay. And so teaching children just that very basic aspect of in that moment where I want to yell and I want to scream, can I stop and can I count to 5 is huge. And what it tells us and what the research tells us about that is that we can absolutely help our youth manage themselves in that classroom because we're providing them tools that nobody else has, right? We have to teach our children emotional intelligence. We have to teach them that conflict resolution. And we have to provide our teachers the resources to do that too. And because one of the things that has happened is everybody starts talking about trauma-informed classrooms, and it becomes another thing that a teacher has to do that they're underpaid for and overwhelmed with. And so I can tell you right now that if we wanted to disrupt the school to prison pipeline, we need to pay our teachers better. We need to give them better resources. And we need to make sure that we're incorporating in conflict resolution, social skills, and the basic tenets of teaching our kids just how to be, right? Our kids are so stressed. This generation is more stressed than any other generation that's come before. And we could talk a lot about the role of social media and electronics with that, but I feel like our kids are also just surrounded by parents who aren't breathing and who aren't relaxing and who aren't showing them the power of rest. And so if we can incorporate that into our schools, we'll do a lot of good. Additionally, if you have kids in school and there's a school resource officer, ask what the policies are. Ask what the policies are about when they make a referral to the school resource officer. What are the duties of the school resource officer, right? Because school resource officers can be so cool, right? But we also need to make sure that we're thinking about, is it cool for everybody? And does it work for everybody? And those are the questions that we need to be asking. So in 2 minutes, that's school to prison pipeline. I will tell you that the ACLU has a ton of resources on that. And so it's a great place to start. KC, ACLU, they also put together an event recently. So I imagine that they'll have another one soon. We'd be happy to come back and spend 2 hours talking with you about that too. But do me a favor and practice the rule of 5 at some point tomorrow, because I will promise you it's going to change your life. Somebody put in there the Apple Watch. I will tell you, I make a regular practice of getting up from my desk every day. So that moment where I start to feel really stressed and overwhelmed, I stand up, I'm stretching my body, right? Whatever you can do in regards to that is helpful. But I'm going to tell you right now that if you stop and you practice your breathing at least once a day, it's going to really change your life. And I say that as a non-crunchy person, right? Like if you had told me that 2 years ago, I'd have been like, okay, right? But you could do this in 30 seconds. And significantly impact the way in which you engage in the world. So that was my long answer.
And I would take the other approach. I love Misty's crunchy. My action steps would be we have to stop criminalizing normal childhood behavior. And we have to have one set of rules for everyone. So, when we look at Jackson County and kiddos that are certified for adult court, we would be remiss to not mention that Black and brown kiddos are sent to adult court at a higher rate. And that needs to change. When they are involved in the criminal justice process, when they are certified for adult court, it looks different. And those extra legal factors shouldn't come into play. Additionally, we should be looking at juveniles who are criminal justice involved. Sometimes those kiddos, instead of being viewed as perpetrators, should be viewed as victims, and we should be concerned about what their ACE scores are. I know there are a lot of great multidisciplinary teams that are working with kiddos that are criminal justice involved, much like our teachers. They need to be paid more. We've got Jackson County CASA and their caseworkers are overworked. Their guardian ad litems are overworked. I think from a policy and a procedure standpoint, we got to get the information out there so that people know what's going on right under our noses with kiddos in our community who, like I mentioned in the theory, they may not know. They may not know that what they're participating in is wrong, or how serious it is. So.
Yeah. And I think that one thing that's changed from when I was a student to now is that when you had these outbursts in the past, rather than calling a school resource officer, you were sent to the guidance counselor or to the principal, right? Rather than immediately involving law enforcement.
And I think that, to Lindsay's point, also making sure that we're being equitable, right? But also, like, the very first part of that sentence, can we also just talk about why are we criminalizing things that don't need to be criminalized, right? I saw somebody end up with a charge because they threw a loaf of bread. Like, I don't know that needs to be something that we're involving our criminal justice system with, right? And so really thinking about that and who gets charged and who doesn't. And also, what are the options for that child that's charged? So I would add that too. If we're going to talk about policies, how are we sentencing people and what resources are we giving our juveniles, and how does that differ based on the area that they live in, and also just simply the demographics of that youth is going to be really important. We have a few questions here. So we have somebody with a question about the court system.
That's me.
Perfect. So I go ahead and share your question with them.
Okay, so my question is, it's more about, like, are there people out there helping this? My kids fortunately went to a very privileged school, and privileged kids get into quite a bit of trouble. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing to me how, like, one got caught with cocaine, DWI, and marijuana, and got 20 hours of community service, and no felony, like, got everything removed during COVID when court wasn't happening. So then you hear about a kid in not so privileged area that has a joint and serves 6 months. So we talk a lot about the police and what the police do that's unfair, but isn't it really going on in the court system, and who can afford an attorney and who can't? And why can judges make those decisions?
Buy this book and read it. This is on the handout that I'll send out, but Charged, which is talking about, they have a kiddo he grabs a gun, right? And what happens to his case as he moves through the system. But Emily Bazelon focuses on this, right? Like, we're gonna look at these cases and see what cases move through a formal process, which ones move through kind of an informal or like a probationary period. And she talks about how, by and large, the most important, I shouldn't say important, the most influential person within the criminal court system is the prosecutor. And if we really want to be looking at who we can bend the ear of, it's the prosecutor. And that, at the juvenile or at the adult level, they really make those determinations on which cases move through, how they move through the criminal court system. So I have every student that takes my courts class read this book. And I'm not joking when I have had dozens of students say that book changed my life. I wanted to be, I wanted to be a social worker. I wanted to be criminal defense. Now I want to be the prosecutor, because if you get to decide which area that you want to be in right now, it's really important that we have prosecutors that understand how their role fits into this system. Mass incarceration doesn't start with the Department of Corrections. It really, you have to piecemeal that back and say, who's the gatekeeper? And in a lot of instances, it's who gets involved in the formal process and who doesn't, like you mentioned, jurisdictionally. So.
And I would add to that, you know, you had made a comment about focusing on law enforcement. We focus on them because they're the most visible, right? They're the most visible, and so people focus on them. But the prosecutor has the most discretion in the criminal
Right.
justice system. They have more discretion than anybody else. Additionally, that goes back to what we can do for communities and community supports, because if I'm a prosecutor and I'm trying to use discretion, but I don't have any community places to send people, if I don't have treatment centers, if I don't have therapy, if I can't, if the only option available to me is a fine or an incarceration, that's what I'm going to lend myself to, because it's the only thing available. So part of what we have to do is also really invest in communities and make sure that, you know, part of the reason it looks different when you're in a privileged community is because the resources are there. There's something else to do. So part of creating equity is making sure that in every community there are places and there are options available.
So
And
are there checks and balances for a prosecutor? I mean, like that you can file a report for a police officer, but can you do that for a prosecutor? And there's any, I mean, just with the bar?
Depends on if there's misconduct, you know, but prosecutorial.
So just making shady decisions is not misconduct.
Non-appealable. Yeah.
I know for personal experience, I was hit by a car on the plaza and they weren't going to do anything. And I was talking to the prosecutor and like, you know, this needs to happen. And it wasn't until they found out who I was. And I had no clue, but a senator got involved because he's very good friends with our family. And all of a sudden in the court system, like they locked the doors so nobody could get out. They like threw the guy down on the ground. I mean, the guy didn't mean to hit me. It wasn't like he intentionally hit me, but it was eye-opening to be like, oh, because now I'm somebody to this person that, you know, and that's so unfair.
Yeah.
I will say that this is where your local elections matter. So the person who's giving oversight to your prosecutor, right? You're electing those people. So if we're trying to think about, we want more restorative practices, we want to bend the ear of the local prosecutors. What are the views of the person that you're electing to provide them oversight, and how committed to equitable decision making and resource development are they? Local elections always matter, guys. I also will highlight for you, somebody put in here taking the racial equity challenge, and I would agree with you. Taking that is fantastic and really goes along with what we're talking about here. We don't have enough time to get in tonight to all of the ways in which all the variables that influence how you're treated in the system, and the ways in which it can be incredibly not just unequitable but damaging. And so there's a lot more to unpack there, and in the resource sheet, a couple of the books really focus on that. An American Summer really dives into community trauma and racialized violence, and the ways in which we just really decide that some people are not worth caring about. And so definitely utilize that resource sheet to dive a lot deeper, because there's a lot to unpack there. But we do have an unfair system, right? It is unfair on a class basis. It is unfair on a race basis, and even on a gender basis, right? A lot of people don't realize this, but if you're good looking, you're a lot less likely to be convicted, right? And so, you know, there's all sorts of things that contribute to the ways in which we could improve our systems. And the more knowledgeable we become as a community about those, that's the first step to trying to enact change. The influenza case is a perfect example. Oh yeah. Brock Turner is a great example. We could go through a lot of those. Really appreciate, I'm just looking through all of these that everybody has put in here. Beauty is currency, absolutely. Even height. If you're a tall male, people find you more trustworthy. It's kind of a fascinating thought, right? Anybody else? These are all really great questions.
And Erica put in the chat, you know, you all are more than welcome to contact Misty and I about any questions that you have. on the handout, I will have both of our emails, and you're welcome to yeah, ask us anything that you are curious about. I teach hate and bias crimes here at UMKC, so I tutored a lot of friends that were like, I'm embarrassed to admit at almost 40 that I don't understand what's happening. I'm happy to walk you through it from a non-judgmental standpoint, you know, because I think sometimes you get down the road and you're like, I should understand how the criminal justice system works, and you don't know where to start. I'll be your friend. I can teach you. We'll do it.
And I will tell you, even if it's not a question, or like, man, I just want to geek out with somebody about this topic, we'll be that person for you.
We've listened to all the podcasts. We've watched all the serial killer documentaries. Yes, we can talk about it for sure.
I spent all day doing that today.
Yep.
Watching all the serial killer documentaries.
It's part of our job, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Any other final questions? Great. Thank you so much to Lindsey and Misty for doing this with us. We truly appreciate your time and your expertise on these topics. Thank you for having us, or thank you for doing this. And thank you guys all for attending as well. And we look forward to seeing you again on the next one. I believe the next training that we have coming out of community conversations and advocacy, as well as civic leadership, is on mental health, and that is on March 30th. Then we have an upcoming one on food insecurity and community issues in Kansas City. So look forward to seeing you guys there.
Awesome.
I love it. Thank you guys for having us.
Bye, guys.
Bye.